Tonight we are going to be considering current events. And one of the things that I like to do is when we have such a topic like this that sort of resonates with maybe keeping up to date with what is happening in the world, is to perhaps begin with a few questions. Now what we're going to need tonight is, of course, our Bibles, which we have clearly. We'll be diving into a few passages in order to help understand maybe the character of what we're reading. And starting with that lens, looking outward into the world in order to identify what we might believe helps us to know that God is still working in the kingdom of men. Now, I thought we might just endeavor to answer 4 simple questions, and our task will be to go away tonight having better understood the answers to these 4 questions, and they are: what has Russia gained in Ukraine? We would like to understand what have they actually gained by venturing into this war. Second question, how has Israel fared in the Gaza Strip? Certainly a provocation from Gaza outwards, but how has Israel managed in this war? Our third question is in recent time, very recent time, who has gained significant seats of power? And what have they done with those seats of power? And finally, why has Israel chosen now to strike Iran? So what's nice is sort of couching our comments tonight with these questions is, God willing, we should go away with very satisfactory answers to spur us on to perhaps pursue even more, or to feel at least educated that when we leave the Bible school and others in the world want to speak about these topics, we feel like we have at least a good footing. Because obviously we have a great footing in the scriptures, but we want to have a good footing perhaps on current events. And that's what we're aiming to do tonight. Now, I will have a couple questions on the screen. And what I would like you to do is by no means answer your answer out loud. I would love for you to just answer in the quietness of your own head. And that way, no one will know if you got the question wrong. But you will, in an almost sort of like minuscule amount of pride, say, I got it right. So these questions will be on the screen, but by no means am I asking you to shout them out. So the first of which is 1,222 days ago, something commenced as it pertains to current events. So have a think, what commenced 1,222 days ago from today that commenced as it has to do with current events? Now the answer is the war in Ukraine began 1,222 days ago. And I'm very happy to report that up at the front there's a few elbow pumps, like little fist pumps, that some of the young gentlemen had got the answer right, so good for you. Now, we look at 1,222 days and we think, yeah, but, we're really accustomed to 365 or something to that effect. Really doesn't resonate with the length. In the 20th century, there was a significant event that lasted 1,567 days. And in a second, I'll give you what that event was, but it helps us to sort of identify with how long the war in Ukraine has been going on. So the event in the 20th century that lasted 1,567 days was this: World War I, that took place primarily in Europe. So if you can understand the length of time that World War I took place from reading from the history books, or perhaps from talking to someone who might have been involved in it, that gives us a really good idea of how long the war in Ukraine is going for and continues to go for. That it will be, if it doesn't find a resolution, approaching the length of World War I. As I understand, they called it the Great War. Now, we are going to try and identify, well, why has Russia come into Ukraine, and what have they gained from this war already, okay? Now, what you see here on the slide, I'm going to click through them at a moderate pace, but you're going to see in the red Russia making their advances. And I want you to sort of pay special attention to where Russia made their advances and where they were repelled back, but where they found, Russia that is, they could not give up, okay? So on February 24th, They made their advance with rockets and bombs, etc., in their advance into Ukraine. And I'll just sort of toggle through these as they go forward, okay? So 24th of February, 25th of February, 26th of February, so what you notice is they made incursion around the Russian border, but you would have perceptively seen that there in the north, they were repelled, Ukraine repelled them, and Russia let go of those lands. But there at the very bottom right, what you see is that Russia has not relinquished those lands. And it is for a very specific reason that they have not relinquished those lands. Now, the toll in Ukraine is immense, and only to sort of show it in some visuals, some of the pictures here show you the befores and afters of the devastation that Ukraine has borne in this war. So here's burning homes and craters seen in Rivpilya. Here's missile attack on residential areas like in Irpin. Damage to apartment buildings such as Kiev. Damage in Svoboda Square in Kharkiv. And missile attacks on council buildings also in Kharkiv. And so you just imagine that one day your city is fine and it is up and it is moving, and then after this war begins, there is devastation all around. Now, from Russia's perspective, though, Russia actually has quite a toll that it is taking on them. And there are estimates on the top end that Russia has spent in excess of $250 billion in order to have this war. And not only have they spent the money, but very sadly, they have also spent the manpower. Because just recently, they have good estimates that Russia has actually passed the 1 million mark in terms of casualties in this Ukraine war. Now, how do they know that? Because, Putin is not going to release the actual casualties. The media is going to sort of play their manipulative games. But what they've been able to assess from various parts of Russia is the funeral business has been booming back in Russia. So take, for example, since the start of the war in Ukraine, Russia's military casualties have remained a closely guarded state secret. But look a little closer, and the signs of devastation are unmistakable. From the booming funeral industry to the rising number of veterans returning home without arms or legs. And in total, between January and April of this year, the funeral service providers in the country earned nearly 40 billion rubles, or 380 million, a 12.7% year-on-year increase according to Rosstat, Russia's Federal State Statistics Service. So Russia, are not only spending gobs of money, but they are losing, sadly, many lives. Now, what I want you to do is come with me to Daniel chapter 11, okay? And what we would endeavor to do with each of these sections is trying to identify what is the character of these countries that we're looking at. And we're going to look at here in Daniel chapter 11, the character of the king of the north, which Russia will occupy. Now, there's something interesting to note. I'm sure there's lots of interesting things to note in Daniel 11 here in this little section. But we're going to read from Daniel 11, verse 40 to 43. And I want you to pay special attention to these countries that are overrun by the king of the north. And I'm going to ask you to just have a think, is what do they all share in common that Russia is ever so eager to have dominance over? So here in Daniel chapter 11, here's what we read in verse 40. At the time of the end shall the king of the south push at Turkey, and the king of the north shall come against Turkey like a whirlwind, with chariots, with horsemen, and many ships. And he shall enter into the countries, and shall overflow and pass over. So you'll know that in verse 40, I've inserted there the hymn for Turkey. Turkey receives sort of like this whirlwind approach from the king of the north that sort of occupies their vicinity, their region, that is Turkey's. In verse 41, The king of the north shall enter also into the glorious land, and many countries shall be overthrown, but these shall escape out of his hand: Edom and Moab and the chief of the children of Ammon. And we will know that these are those sort of nations that are on the east side of Jordan. Okay, so they sort of seem to escape here in verse 41 of Daniel 11. But here's what it says in verse 42 of Daniel 11. That the king of the north shall stretch forth his hand also upon the countries, and the land of Egypt shall not escape. But he shall have power over the treasures of gold and of silver, and over all the precious things of Egypt, and the Libyans and the Ethiopians shall be at his steps. Now I ask you to think about it. What do all of these countries have in common that the king of the north is so eager to occupy? Turkey, Egypt, Libya, Ethiopia. And the answer is they all have borderlands on the sea. So take, for example, the Black Sea, the Mediterranean Sea, the Red Sea. All of these countries of which we read of here in Daniel chapter 11 all have a strategic position that they have access to the water. And that's exactly what we would expect, because in verse 40, this is one of the primary features that this army comes into this area, the area of Israel, is they have many ships. And what we are noticing is that what Israel has gained in Ukraine is, though they are spending gobs of money and though they are losing many men, they have secured the water ports of southern Ukraine. And secured them they have, and this for a very good reason. Because though they have secured these ports, they will have an intention to actually get more and more and utilize their fleet of ships as we see the day of Christ approaching. Now, these shipping ways, these ports, are ever so important. They provide such a strategic position in terms of influence and power. In fact, Putin has now received his name, the Pirate of the Black Sea. Now here in the red, these are the controlling ports that Russia has now occupied since its incursion into Ukraine. And you notice there on the left, the blue, that Ukraine has actually been squeezed into these ports. And some of them don't have the sort of technological advancements to move these sort of shipments that they have into the sea. I'm going to play a video for you in a second to sort of show why this is important for Russia to take these ports. So much of Ukraine's exports were reliant on these ports, but now they're in the hands of Russia. Uber amounts of tons of cargo move through these ports every year, and Russia is controlling them. So one thing that's particular to sort of think about and what is being controlled is we just came back from the cafeteria, and it's food. And I don't have to tell those that are in charge of the grocery bills in the homes, whether it's in Canada or America, but the food bill has certainly gone up, and it is thanks in some part to Russia having this Putin's blockade. Sorry, Brother Dan. Do you want me to? Oh, that's okay. That's all right. I'll just come back here for a second. So as Brother Dan's doing that, notice some of the things that are coming out of these ports. Odessa handles 75% of Ukraine's exports. The port of Mariupol, which now Russia controls, they were exporting steel, coal, and grain. Russia exporting 76 million tons of wheat a year. They have dominance over that. There in the middle bottom, the Bosphorus, it's in. That's okay. The Bosphorus there in Turkey, 639 million tons of cargo a year, and these trade routes on the water lead to Europe and to the Americas. We're all good. Sorry if I blast you on the volume, we'll get it right in a second.
If you look at just foodstuffs alone, Russia and Ukraine are 30% of the world wheat supply, 20% of the corn supply, and 80% of sunflower oil. So it's often called the breadbasket of Europe, but it's really, really important source of raw materials for both food for people, but also for livestock, which then go on to feed people So it's a really important region, and it's really important that we find a solution to enable those exports to come out of the ports, whether escorted or not, so that we don't end up with a major food security crisis much further across the world over the coming months.
Now, we are definitely in a food security crisis as we are today. And one of the reasons is, you're going to see in this next video, is because of Russia's dominance and controlling these seaports in Ukraine.
These ships show port calls at Ukraine's Black Sea ports in the days before Russia invaded the country. Here's how that compares to the days after the fighting broke out, 6 months after the war started under the Black Sea Grain Initiative, and then again this summer after the Black Sea grain deal fell apart. They show how Moscow's economic war against Ukraine is playing out in the Black Sea, causing key Ukrainian exports to plunge, something Russia has benefited from as its exports are reaching record highs. So how has Russia sought to control shipping to and from Ukraine, and what are Kyiv and its allies trying to do to counter that blockade? Before the war, Ukraine's Black Sea ports exported 95% of the country's wheat, corn, and sunflower oil. Ukraine's agricultural products account for 41% of the country's total exports, meaning they are major drivers of Ukraine's economy. Wanting to choke Ukraine off financially, Russia has taken aim at these ports since the invasion began. It's done this in a number of different ways. It's tried to capture some strategic port cities, and it's bombarded others with missiles. It's also destroyed infrastructure used to export grain and moved warships into shipping corridors. Now, there has been a caveat. Last July in Turkey, Moscow, under diplomatic pressure, agreed to a UN-brokered deal known as the Black Sea Grain Initiative. That paved the way for Ukrainian food products, and only food products, to flow from these 3 ports. You can see that port calls picked up, but they never fully recovered to those pre-war levels. And Russia was accused of slowing down shipping by holding up inspections.
So one thing we will want to be looking on is, with this war in Ukraine, will Russia now sort of circumvent the bottom of Ukraine and try and cut off Ukraine entirely? So what has Russia gained in Ukraine? They have gained a very strategic position that we see identified in Daniel chapter 11, that the king of the north will want to have all the access points available to him with Ukraine, with Turkey, with Egypt, with Libya, with the Ethiopians, so that he can fulfill his role as the king of the north. And he's doing it right now. Now, as we move into our second question, 632 days ago, ask yourself, what began in this time, 632 days ago? Now, the answer is Gaza moved out from the Gaza Strip and attacked the nation of Israel from the Gaza Strip 632 days ago. So what we're going to look at now is, how has Israel fared in the Gaza Strip? And how are they doing compared with this war that they are involved in? Now, on October 7th, this was the deadliest history attack on Israel. And this is what they did from the Gaza Strip on October 7, 2023. Hamas launched the largest ever terrorist attack on Israeli soil. The Palestinian organization, considered a terrorist group by the EU and the US, stormed through the security fence separating Gaza and Israel in the early morning. And what they did is they killed 1,189 people, including 815 civilians. They wounded 7,500, and they took 251 individuals hostage. Now, here is a sort of like a rendering of the Gaza Strip. And what you notice is there is a large gray wall that was constructed around the Gaza Strip. Now, in terms of the scale of this wall, it's 65 kilometers wide, 40 miles, and it is 6 meters high, or 20 feet high, and it is several meters deep. And they actually have this wall that was built by Israel to keep the Gaza Strip. But when they actually built this wall, Israel was so confident, when they concluded it in December of 2021, that it would keep Hamas in, and they'd be able to sort of keep track of all the movements going on at the border. In fact, stretching along the entire boundary between Israel and the Gaza Strip, this wall was $1.1 billion in making, and it was a wall and a fence hailed as the only one of its kind in the world. For Israel, it was a culmination of 3.5 years' work, the latest in a series of fortifications and security measures that isolated Gaza, the 2 million plus Palestinians living in that region. But what happened is on October 7, 2023, in the early morning, there were 6 checkpoints that were breached, and the Gazans moved out and they carried out their attack on Israel. And there, what you see in the top right is a loader, and one of the checkpoints that they breached, they use a loader just to break down the barricade. And there in the bottom right, that is actually an Israeli tank that was near the border. They took it over and they burned it. So the coordinated attacks were all filmed with the sun rising in the distance, indicating that they were filmed around 6:40 a.m. when the sun rose on that Saturday. And what we actually see is subsequent, Israel has actually bombarded the Gaza Strip with many rockets and have devastated this Gaza Strip. And some of the before and afters are quite incredible, but it's taken such a toll on those that are living in Gaza in terms of economic and their well-to-do. So August 2022 to November 2023, devastation. Prices in Gaza soaring, the economy is crashing. They used to have lorries or trucks moving in with goods, no more. And the debris produced is so great that it's 17 times the total from all the Israel-Gaza conflicts since 2008. And in 2024, they estimate that there's over 50 million tons of debris. And because it's sort of hard to identify what a ton is, it's 2,000 pounds, but a fully loaded 747 is 500 tons. So that gives you the scale of how many tons of debris have been broken up in the Gaza Strip, okay? Now, what they're hoping for, though, is a ceasefire. And, of course, the President of the United States, he is in the middle of it. And here's what he's just said just recently, June 28th, the hopes for a ceasefire agreement in the coming week. U.S. President Donald Trump says there could be a ceasefire agreement within the next week. And taking questions from reporters on Friday, he said, we're working on Gaza and trying to get it taken care of. Some 50 hostages remain in Gaza, fewer than half believed to still be alive. And they were among 251 hostages taken when Hamas attacked Israel on October 7, 2023, sparking the war. Now, what I want you to do is come with me to Amos chapter 1. Because some of us might be surprised that the word Gaza actually is in the scriptures as it pertains to prophetical events. So Gaza, obviously, we know from lots of the Old Testament, the Philistines working in and amongst Gaza. But when you come to Amos chapter 1, we actually learn something about how Gaza Strip will actually be connected with prophetical events. And here's what we read in Amos chapter 1. And it's amazing because they built this wall, they trapped in the Gaza Strip, and look what we read here in Amos chapter 1, verse 6 and 7. Certainly a latter-day fulfillment. Verse 6 of Amos 1. Thus saith the Lord, for 3 transgressions of Gaza, and for 4, I will not turn away the punishment thereof, because they carried away the captive, the whole captivity, to deliver them up to Edom. But I will send a fire on the wall of Gaza, which shall devour the palaces thereof. So a few things that's worthy to note in terms of what we're seeing in current events is in verse 6, that Gaza actually carried Israel captive in some regards. They carried the whole captivity, and they wanted to deliver them up to Edom. No mercy. The whole captivity was to be delivered up. And also in verse 7, it says that there was going to be a fire sent on the wall of Gaza, which shall devour the palaces thereof. And you can go online and look at all the pictures of the devastation in Gaza today. So certainly in the time of Amos, in this northern kingdom of Israel, Gaza was going to have a judgment. But I suggest to you that in the latter day we are seeing that this is being reenacted again. And how has Israel fared in the Gaza Strip? They have completely and utterly annihilated the Gaza Strip. But you have to sort of wonder, sort of use a world's expression. When you corner and animal, you have to expect that it's going to try and come out of that corner. So like we're going to be seeing with Russia, we believe, in terms of leading up to Christ, trying to conquer more shipping lanes, with Gaza, it would not be surprising to see that they're going to try and have another push through, and perhaps even more dangerous than the one that they've already laid out in 2023. Now we're going to move into our third section, who has gained significant seats of power. 161 days ago, a very significant event took place, and an individual took a seat of power. So who was that individual 161 days ago? Now, usually you would say, well, the Americans should get this, but boy, Canada being the little brother, we know all about it too. But 161 days ago, Donald Trump was re-elected 161 days ago. Now, brothers and sisters, I'm sure that when you saw these things sort of come up in the news, you think, really, he's running again? I mean, that's got to be sort of like the longest of chances. Well, others took notice too. And in fact, with what happened with Donald Trump being reelected, there was only one other individual who followed the very same pattern. There were other presidents that did sort of initiatives, but not the same pattern. Donald Trump's decision to seek the White House again in 2024 put him among a small group of ex-presidents who have subsequently run for elective office. But Grover Cleveland is the only former president who has ever come back after being defeated for re-election to win a second non-consecutive term. Cleveland, he won in 1884, lost in 1888, renominated in 1892, and decisively beat Benjamin Harrison, the man he had lost to 4 years earlier. I mean, you can almost just insert our years, and you can insert Donald Trump's opponents. Now, they called it an incredible comeback. And such an incredible comeback was they called it the most dramatic comeback in U.S. political history. Now, I don't know if that's superlative or hyperbole, but certainly it was something worth noting. And when he lost in 2020, Donald Trump, it was sort of like a wipeout from the Electoral College perspective. 270 to win, Joe Biden got 306, left Donald Trump in behind. But in 2024, how Donald Trump pulled off the greatest comeback in political history. Now, what I want you to do is come with me to Daniel chapter 2, because Donald Trump clearly has re-established himself in a very powerful seat. But when you come to Daniel chapter 2, there's perhaps some connections to what Daniel was going through at the time of Nebuchadnezzar to what we perhaps see today. And it gives us an idea of how we should behave ourselves when we see these things in terms of not losing heart or having a good focus on the kingdom of God, not the kingdom of men. Now, here's what it says in Daniel chapter 2. Now note the context of Daniel 2. Verse 18. That Daniel and his fellows would not perish with the rest of the wise men of Babylon. Now, what had happened in Daniel 2? Nebuchadnezzar had a dream. He wakes up. I want the wise men. No one's got the answer. You're all dead. And you just see with Nebuchadnezzar that he was a man of incredibly dangerous spontaneity. I think it, I make the decision. That was Nebuchadnezzar for much of his reign. So is that not very similar to perhaps what we might see today? I think it, and I make a decision. So might we then take the Daniel approach when we are faced with such things, whether in the workplace or whether we see on the news? Because in verse 19 of Daniel chapter 2, then was the secret revealed unto Daniel in a night vision. Then Daniel blessed the God of heaven. And notice these 3 times in Daniel 2, verse 20 to 23, the word wisdom comes up. Daniel answered and said, verse 20, blessed be the name of God forever and ever, for wisdom and might are his. He changeth the times and the seasons. He removeth kings and setteth up kings. He giveth wisdom unto the wise, knowledge to them that know understanding. He revealeth the deep and secret things, and he knoweth what is in the darkness, and the light dwelleth with him. And finally, verse 23 of Daniel 2, I thank thee and praise thee, O thou God of my fathers, who has given me wisdom and might, and hast made known unto me now what we desired of thee. For thou hast now made known unto us the king's matter. And so in verse 20 and verse 21 and verse 23, you have this wisdom. Daniel is not swept away with the spontaneity of this ruling man. He is like a ship which is anchored, and he is calm. You know, it's interesting because I remember hearing this expression not too long ago, but there's a difference between knowledge and wisdom, okay? And I did not come up with this expression, but you're welcome to sort of look up where it came from. Miles Kingdon, a British journalist, but here's what he said about knowledge and wisdom. Knowledge is knowing a tomato is a fruit, but wisdom is not putting it in a fruit salad. You see, brothers and sisters, we have both knowledge and we have wisdom, but we have to blend them together. We have to use them where they are appropriate. And though we see certain men take certain seats of power and they impact our lives, we are not in the midst of a storm. Because what happens to any ship that finds itself in the midst of a storm is any harbor will do. But we don't want any harbor. We want the city of comfort. So may that not be like us, maybe like Daniel, who when faced with individuals who had seats of power, who were men just like Nebuchadnezzar, that we are actually applying our wisdom. Okay, 108 days ago, something took place, and for maybe half the audience, I wouldn't be offended, probably a little bit shocked if you couldn't remember what took place 108 days ago. 108 days ago, Canada received a new prime minister, okay? Now, bonus points if you actually know who this gentleman's name is before I put it on the screen. But 108 days ago, Canada actually received a new prime minister. Now, I couldn't believe when I heard this on the radio. They actually used this word. You know, the radio doesn't really use this word very often. And the word that they used was a miracle. And for those of us in Canada, you sort of sat back, you observed what was happening in the political arena, and you thought, oh, wow, I would not have used the word miracle. I mean, God directs the leaders in power, but boy, it certainly seemed like one. Now, this gentleman's name, Mark Carney, he certainly must have pulled off a political miracle. It was an election like no other. The NDP was wiped out on Monday night, its leader, Jagmeet Singh, immediately announcing his resignation. What looked like the clear-cut winner, Conservative leader Pierre Poilievre, otherwise commanding campaign performance, was overshadowed. He even lost his own seat because there were 100 people on the bill. The Bloc Québécois suffered major losses, and Liberal leader Mark Carney's political miracle was real. But there was one thing to note about this political miracle, because although the Conservative blue line, Pierre Poilievre, was way ahead in the polls leading up, he dipped. Mark Carney in the red, his Liberals, they came above, and they held on into the election night. And on the top right, you see 172 seats are needed to form sort of the majority government, and the Liberals only got 169. So even that, the political mirror was overshadowed, that Mark Carney didn't actually get the amount of seats to form a majority government. He's still our prime minister, but they have to, as it were, work together. But then the fallout of the election came out, and a few things of note is this. There was a very clear divide between who voted in Canada and for whom they voted, and it's this. Canadians were split amongst age groups. In casting their votes in Monday's federal election, with different issues driving their choices, Canadians aged 55 and older leaned towards the Liberals, who were seen as the party that would best handle U.S. President Donald Trump, but younger Canadians aged 18 to 34 almost exclusively picked the Conservatives, based on their perception of who would best address affordability and the rising cost of living. Now, just come from Daniel chapter 2 and come back to Ezekiel chapter 38, okay? The main issue that took place in Canada over this election actually affirms what we know about countries like Canada, who are under the Commonwealth, okay? Because in Canada, notice the attitude of the young lions, and certainly Canada is one of them. Their attitude in Ezekiel chapter 38 centers on money. And how do we know that? Well, Ezekiel 38, verse 10. Thus saith the Lord God, it shall come to pass that at the same time shall things come into thy mind, O Gog, and thou shalt think an evil thought. Thou shalt say, I will go up to the land of unwalled villages. I will go to them that are at rest, that dwell safely, all of them dwelling without walls and having neither bars nor gates. And what I want you to notice is from verse 12 to verse 13, notice the taking that the young lions are focused on. Verse 12, to take a spoil, to take a prey, to turn thine hand upon the desolate places that are now inhabited, and upon the people that are gathered out of the nations which have gotten cattle and goods that dwell in the midst of the land. Verse 13, and Sheba and Dedan and the merchants of Tarshish, with all the young lions thereof, shall say unto thee, art thou come to take a spoil? Hast thou gathered thy company to take a prey, to carry away silver and gold, to take away cattle and goods, to take a great spoil? And in verse 12 and 13, the character of those that make up the young lions is when Gog makes its move, they are focused on money. That's all they care about. You don't see in verse 12 or 13, you're going against God's people. That's the Holy Land. They don't say that. All they care about is the financial might of one of their partners. And the gentleman who is now our Prime Minister, he used to be the Bank of Canada, the Bank of England, and now he is back in Canada. And so the character traits of which we see of the young lions, Canada being one, is that the focus on the financial consequences of Ezekiel 38 will be front and center for Canada. Will it mean that they'll move in the war? Not likely. But boy, they'll be so miffed that the money is draining into the bank account of Gog. And that's what we see. Our last one in section 3, 53 days ago. 53 days ago, someone took a final seat of power. And that would be Pope Leo. Pope Leo, 53 days ago, took on the name Pope Leo. Now, here is a bonus level question. So for those keeners, and you've got all the questions right so far, you think, oh, he can't stump me. I'm going to ask you this question. I'm going to put on a picture on the screen, and you try and think what 267 has to do with the picture, okay? 267, and you try and have a think, 267. So there's no days there. So there's a hint. That is in the Vatican City, but 267. The answer is Pope Leo is the 267th Pope. Okay, so for those keeners, I'm not seeing a lot of fist bumps, but it could be sort of like hidden in the mind. But Pope Leo is the 267th Pope that he is now occupying this position of power. Now, all eyes had to turn on to the conclave, which is a secret meeting, and here is how a pope is chosen, okay? I guess you could kind of say it's 4 simple steps, but step 1 is when a pope dies, 15 to 20 days later, they have to convene. Now, there are over 253 cardinals in the world, but if you're above the age of 80, you are omitted from participating, so only the cardinals under 80 are eligible to actually vote. Step 2, the cardinals vote, secret ballot. Step 3, once the ballots have been counted and they have reached what they believe is the Pope, 2/3 majority, they put up the certain smoke if it's inconclusive, that's black. They put up the white smoke if it is conclusive. And then finally, habeas papam, we have a new Pope, and he comes out and greets those in the Vatican City. But what I found very fascinating is the cardinal electors at the secret vote, who are going to cast 4 votes per day until one candidate secures a 2/3 majority, that a result of broadcasting to the waiting world by burning papers that emit white smoke. One gentleman, German Cardinal Reinhold Marx, told reporters on Saturday, the conclave will just last a few days. Now you have to ask yourself, why would he say that? Because it was probably determined who was going to be the Pope. They knew. They knew who had the number of votes. They knew who didn't. They knew when it got close to maybe one or two candidates who was going to pick which side. And which side you fell on, maybe that Pope, if he was elected, would grant you favor because you voted for him. So it's all a political arena. And speaking of arena, this is what some of the things Pope Leo has been doing very recently. Vatican City, Pope Leo leading a Eucharist procession. And that's when they believe that the actual Eucharist is the present body of the Lord Jesus Christ, him standing in the position of Christ on the way of the Via Dolorosa, the way of pain. And one of his first sermons that he gave to the seminarians was about this. In a meeting with future priests, Pope Leo said celibacy is a charism to be acknowledged, conserved, and to be educated. The pontiff was speaking on Wednesday to seminarians from the diocese in Italian region Triveneto, and Leo urged the seminarians to not think of themselves as alone or by themselves. Now, I want you to come with me to Revelation chapter 17, because what Pope Leo has just said, one of the first things he wants to address, he says, celibacy is not going anywhere. It is going to stay. And what we find in Revelation 17 is one of the most abhorrent turns of hypocrisy you'll ever see in the scriptures. Because in Revelation chapter 17, I want you to notice this word fornication that will come up 3 times in verses 1 to 4. Verse 1, there came one of the 7 angels which had the 7 vials, talked with me, saying unto me, come hither, and I will show unto thee the judgment of the great prostitute that sitteth upon many waters, with whom the kings of the earth hath committed fornication, and the inhabitants of the earth have been made drunk with the wine of her fornication. So twice in verse 2, you find this word fornication. And the word fornication, you can look it up on your own, but it has the most sinister of ideas of unlawful lust. And that this woman is consummating this unlawful lust with all the kings of which she comes in contact with. Verse 3, so he carried me away in the spirit into the wilderness, and I saw a woman sit upon a scarlet-covered beast full of the names of blasphemy, having 7 heads and 10 horns. And verse 4 says, the woman was arrayed in purple and scarlet color, decked with gold and precious stone, pearls, having a golden cup in her hand, full of abominations and filthiness of, 3rd time, her fornication. You see, what Pope Leo did is in his sermon, he said celibacy, which is Catechism 1579, that all ordained ministers are to remain celibate, that the system of which Pope Leo is the head is anything but celibate. And so what we are seeing is the shroud of hypocrisy continued with this Pope, that he is continuing on the traditions of which we see from the Catholic Church, in which the Bible is very clear that they will commence. And so now we turn to our final section. Why has Israel chosen now to strike Iran? Now, 17 days ago, okay, this one will be a throwaway, right? This will be really simple. But 17 days ago, something began, and it almost happened like overnight. In fact, in terms of where we are, it did happen overnight. And that was the raid in Iran, or the wars in Iran. Now, why did Israel choose now to strike Iran? In September 27th, 2012, Benjamin Netanyahu addressed the 67th United Nations General Assembly at the UN headquarters. And some of you remember, you might have even watched this live. He literally drew a red line with a marker on this ticking time bomb, and he said at 90% uranium enriched, it's a red line. We cannot not allow Iran to have this. And the reason is because at 90% uranium enriched, you have a nuclear bomb. Now, take a guess in your own head. How much does a nuclear power plant need, percentage-wise, of uranium just to run? So if a nuclear bomb needs 90%, the most devastating thing I guess we know to man, but how much does a simple nuclear power plant need in terms of enriched uranium percent just to run? And the answer is 3 to 5. So when Iran says, hey, we're just enriching to this amount to run a nuclear plant, you say, yeah, you've gone past that amount and then some. So when Israel chose to act is because they felt, and with good reason, that Iran was ever so close to breaching that 90% threshold. So they chose to act, okay? And here's how they acted. Now what you're gonna see in this video is the tactile response that Israel had gone in previously with their cybersecurity attacks to bring down the air defense systems of Iran, and only America could come in because of these B-2 bombers and actually finish the job at these uranium enrichment plants in Iran.
Strike by B-2 stealth bombers in history.
This is a plan that took months and weeks of positioning and preparation so that we could be ready when the President of the United States called.
The operation carried out in complete secrecy, beginning at 12:01 a.m. Saturday morning. About a dozen B-2 bombers taking flight from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. Around half of them heading west towards Guam, those with trackable movements. This was a decoy. Another 7, those with transponders turned off and minimal radio communications, launching a short time later, heading towards Iran. The 18-hour flight to Iran, including mid-air refueling and in-air support.
The B-2s linked up with escort and support aircraft in a complex, tightly timed maneuver requiring exact synchronization across multiple platforms in a narrow piece of airspace, all done with minimal communications.
Approximately 5 p.m. Eastern Time Saturday, a U.S. submarine launching 24 Tomahawk land cruise missiles at key service infrastructure targets for nuclear facility Isfahan. By 6:40 p.m. Eastern Time, the 25-minute mission inside Iran's airspace activating. U.S. fighter jets sweeping in to protect the B-2s from possible enemy missiles and warplanes. The B-2s dropping 30,000-pound massive ordnance penetrator weapons, also known as MACBS, or bunker busters, onto Iran's most complex nuclear enrichment facility, Fordo. Experts say it's carved at least 300 feet below the surface of a stone mountain and reinforced with concrete. The first time ever those bombs used in a strike.
The remaining bombers then hit their targets as well, with a total of 14 MOPs dropped against 2 nuclear target areas.
These before and after satellite images show the destruction at the targeted sites, what appears to be extensive damage in Isfahan. In Natanz, another critical Iranian nuclear facility, an 18-foot wide hole above part of what military officials say is an underground military complex. By the numbers, more than 125 U.S. aircraft, around 75 precision-guided weapons, a piloted mission that was a complete operational surprise.
Iran's fighters did not fly, and it appears that Iran's surface-to-air missile systems did not see us. Throughout the mission, we retained the element of surprise.
Overnight, those bombers returning to Missouri, military officials say it will take time to know the full extent of the damage. And despite all the secrecy surrounding the mission, one of the biggest concerns is whether the Iranians were able to move the enriched uranium before the strikes occurred.
Now, the media cannot help itself because what ends up happening is Donald Trump comes out, he gives us a report on what they believe took place, and other media outlets say, oh, but can we be so sure? So take, for example, the CNN, the U.S. military strikes on 3 of Iran's nuclear facilities last weekend. They did not destroy the core components of the country's nuclear program and likely only set it back by months. But then at the bottom of the article, you read to the end, but we might have to wait a little bit more to see if more intelligence becomes available. And so as one side takes the victory, The other side says, but not so fast, there in the American media. Now, for the sake of time, what I'm going to just summarize here is Vladimir Putin, on the day in St. Petersburg, was giving sort of a State of the Union address, very long, you can watch it on YouTube, over 2 hours. As he was talking, it is very likely that the B-2 bombers were moving through the air heading towards Iran. And one of the questions which they asked about Vladimir Putin is, it said, what are you going to do with all the various fronts that you are engaged in? Ukraine, you might help Iran, that sort of stuff. And at the end of his speech, he said, wherever the Russian boot stands is Russia. So if the Russian boot of the military army moves into a country, they believe that that is now their country. But I want to play you one quick thing that he said also, and it has to do with the state of Israel. Listen to what he said about the population of Israel.
So, in Western media, there are reports saying the following, and I leave the opportunity for you to comment on that. Actually, the Iran war is a good thing for Russia. A, oil is up. B, the West has one more problem on its table to take care of. And 3, Ukraine is on the back burner. So all the news is on Iran rather than Ukraine. How do you comment on that? And what do you say for those who are saying that Russia is unreliable ally because it did not step up for Iran?
Those who promote such narrative about Russia not being a reliable ally are provocateurs. They provoke the situation, and this won't help them. They won't reach their goals. Every conflict is like any other conflict, just on the surface. But as the former Minister of Defense rightfully stated, and the theoretician on military conflicts and military operations, my distinguished colleague, President of Indonesia. By the way, we published his book in Russian on military art. You know, every single country has its own responsibility for what's happening with it. Now, about Russia being reliable or non-reliable as an ally. We've heard that we are supposed to show some solidarity, and this is very true. But each conflict is unique. Let me emphasize that Israel has more than 2 million people who came from the former Soviet Union or Russia. In fact, Israel is almost a Russian-speaking country today. And clearly, in our most recent history, we factor this in.
Russian-speaking country. So as we bring our attention to a conclusion here in a few minutes, what happened is Iran actually had a retaliation bombardment of bombs, many of which did actually not even reach U.S. troops who were stationed in Qatar. But Iran said that the attack in Qatar matched the number of bombs dropped by the United States on its nuclear sites, and this happening over the weekend signaled what could likely be a desire to de-escalate. And so Donald Trump put out on his social media profiles that they have in fact achieved a ceasefire. That though it was sort of skirmished a little bit around the time that it was supposed to begin, he definitely hailed it as sort of a peacetime ceasefire between these two nations. Now I want you to just come with me finally to 1 Thessalonians chapter 5 in terms of what we've been considering tonight. What has Russia gained in Ukraine? How has Israel fared in the Gaza Strip? Who has gained significant seats of power? And why has Israel chosen now to strike Iran? Donald Trump, one of the things that he endeavors the most, and by his own words, is he wants to win the Nobel Peace Prize. which ironically was developed by an individual, Nobel, who actually has to do with the early knowledge of how to create an atom bomb, but that's another topic. But Donald Trump is endeavoring to stable his legacy with the Nobel Peace Prize. And that's exactly what we are to expect when Christ does return, that there will be a time of peace, because everyone will be hailing it as a time of peace. And here's what we read in 1 Thessalonians chapter 5, verse 1. Of the times and seasons, brethren, ye have no need that I write unto you. For yourselves know perfectly that the day of the Lord so cometh as a thief in the night. For when they shall say, peace and safety, then sudden destruction cometh upon them as travail upon a woman with child, and they shall not escape. So what should we be, brothers and sisters, whenever we consider a current event with Bible in hand? What has Russia gained in Ukraine? How has Israel fared in the Gaza Strip? Who has gained significant seats of power? Why has Israel chosen now to strike Iran? Or any question that would come between now and the kingdom that we have, how are we to respond with Bible in hand, soberly? Verse 4, but ye, brethren, are not in darkness, that that day should take you as a thief. For ye are children of the light, the children of the day, and we are not of the night nor of darkness. But therefore let us not sleep as others do, but let us watch and be sober. One day, brothers and sisters, there will come a generation, whether it be alive today or still in the future, that they will see the return of the Lord Jesus Christ. All we can do today is look back through the lens of history. And with Bible in hand, we wonder, are we that generation? But we have to be sober-minded, and we have to be watchful. We have to live our lives in the daytime, walking after the light. Let us not lose hope that what we see, our patience wears thin, because we have looked at the characters of these major players. God is reminding us in the current events of which we see that his word is true, that he doth reign in the kingdom of men. And though there might be 1,000 more current events to come, we will not be like those that sleep, but those that are awake.